Hey Lake Point, Pastor Micah here to get you caught up on the third week of our series, All In. It's not just a series, but a defining moment in the life and history of our church. Throughout All In, we're journeying through the book of Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah lived in Persia, modern-day Iran, 2,400 years ago. 150 years earlier, the Babylonians had invaded Jerusalem and destroyed everything, burning down the temple, the city walls, the gates, everything. The city, and for that matter, the entire country, was left in ruins. And the few remaining Jews that survived the whole ordeal were exiled to Babylon. This was where Nehemiah was born. He had most likely never been to Israel, never been to Jerusalem, but he had received word of how terrible things were going there, despite the fact that exiles had been returning there over the past 90 years. And so he was burdened to do something about it. In chapter 1 of the book of Nehemiah, we learn that Nehemiah was burdened by the news that Jerusalem hadn't got their act together. But what was he going to do? I mean, think about it. He was a slave living in a foreign land over 1,000+ kilometers away from Jerusalem. And to make matters worse, he worked for the king. It wasn't like he could just kind of slip out the back door unnoticed. And besides that, the Babylonians had torn down the walls of Jerusalem for a reason. A defenseless city posed no threat to them. The Persians weren't going to stand by while somebody reestablished Israel as a military presence in that region. Nehemiah was crazy to even consider such a thing. Add to that the fact that the walls had been torn down for almost 150 years. I mean, if the people of Jerusalem had not made any effort to rebuild before now, what made Nehemiah think that showing up would make any difference? After all, as Nate pointed out, he had no authority. He was just a cupbearer to the king whose predecessors had torn down the walls to begin with. On the surface, it would seem that Nehemiah was in the wrong place, working for the wrong job for the wrong guy, and for this vision to be accomplished in and through his life. But just the opposite was true. God had given Nehemiah a job that gave him an inside track to the king. As cupbearer, Nehemiah had a very special relationship with him. It was more than just a job. Every day, the king entrusted his life to the man who served him wine. It was the cupbearer's responsibility to protect the king from being poisoned by his enemies. King Artaxerxes' own father had been murdered by a trusted servant. The king knew all too well the possibility of betrayal from someone within his inner circle. So Nehemiah had to have a lot of credibility with the king in order to be entrusted with this responsibility. In verse 11, we read that Nehemiah prays, "O Lord, please hear my prayer. Listen to the prayers of those of us who delight in honoring you. Please grant me success today by making the king favorable to me. Put it into his heart to be kind to me." Nehemiah prayed because he knew it would take divine intervention for such an opportunity to present itself. It wasn't like Nehemiah could just waltz into the king's presence and make a request. Those who dared to do such things risked execution, but notice how Nehemiah prayed for an opportunity, not a miracle. The reason Nate pointed that out is because we often have a tendency to do the opposite. But in most situations, when it comes to God-given vision, it is more appropriate to pray for an opportunity because God-given visions always involve you. God actually wants to use us. When we pray for opportunities, we are much more likely to recognize them when God brings them along. Prayer keeps us looking. It keeps our eyes and hearts in expectant mode. Prayer doesn't force God's hand, but it keeps us on the lookout for his activity in and through our lives. Nehemiah prayed day after day for an opportunity, and after 4 months of praying, he finally got the chance to speak to the king. You can check it out in chapter 2 of Nehemiah. It says this: "Early the following spring, in the month of Nisan, during the 20th year of King Artaxerxes' reign, I was serving the king his wine. I had never before appeared sad in his presence." Just so you know, Nehemiah wasn't putting on an act. His heart was deeply mourning for his nation and his people showed despite his best efforts to conceal it. Verse 2 says, "So the king asked me, 'Why are you looking so sad? You don't look sick to me. You must be deeply troubled.' Then I was terrified." Why was he terrified? Because the servant's personal life was never to interfere with the serving the king. Nehemiah was terrified because he had let his sadness shown, and he did not know how the king would respond, especially if he told the king the reason for his sorrow. Nonetheless, Nehemiah goes for it. In verse 3, he says, "I replied, 'Long live the king. How can I not be sad? For the city where my ancestors are buried is in ruins, and the gates have been destroyed by fire.'" To Nehemiah's surprise, the king replied in verse 4. The king asked, "Well, how can I help you?" With a prayer to the God of heaven, I replied, "If it please the king, and if you are pleased with me, your servant, send me to Judah to rebuild the city where my ancestors are buried." The king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked, "How long will you be gone? When will you return?" After I told him how long I would be gone, the king agreed to my request. I also said to the king, "If it please the king, let me have letters addressed to the governors of the province west of the Euphrates rivers, instructing them to let me travel safely through their territories on my way to Judah. And please give me a letter addressed to Asaph, the manager of the king's forest, instructing him to give me timber. I will need it to make beams for the gates of the temple fortress, for the city walls, and for a house for myself." And the king granted these requests because the gracious hand of God was on me. It's an amazing development in the story, right? And notice how Nehemiah contributes this grand display of favor due to God's hand upon his life. In other words, God was the one behind this vision. It originated from him, and so God sovereignly guides the king to look favorably upon his request. That being said, it wasn't just all God. It wasn't like Nehemiah idly sat around waiting for God to act. No, Nehemiah spent those 4 months praying and planning. Nehemiah developed a plan in case God granted him the opportunity to cast his vision before the king. Nehemiah's strategy for rebuilding the walls in Jerusalem looked something like this. Step 1, request that the king allow him to leave his post at the palace to rebuild the walls around the city of Jerusalem. Step 2, ask the king to lend financial support to the building project. Step 3, procure letters from the king to the governors in the surrounding area, asking them to provide him with safe travels along the way. Step 4, work out a deal with Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, to obtain enough lumber to build the city gates as well as a home for Nehemiah. Step 5, ask the king for the title of governor of Judah. Step 6, organize and equip the people of Jerusalem. And step 7, begin construction. This is a big, audacious, bold request. Sometimes we mistakenly think that all we are supposed to do is pray, but that's not entirely true. Depending on God doesn't mean we don't carve out a plan. Nehemiah did everything he could to be ready. If God granted him an opportunity to cast his vision before the king, he knew exactly what to ask for. And when Nehemiah made his pitch, the king granted Nehemiah's request. Now, why? Because, as Nehemiah said, the gracious hand of God was upon him. Now, Pastor Nate shared 3 valuable lessons from this part of the story. First, he said, God is using your circumstances to prepare you to accomplish his vision for your life. We can look at Nehemiah's story and marvel at how God perfectly positioned him to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And that's easy for us to do because we know how the story ends. But Nehemiah didn't. He had no idea his years of service to the king had any divine significance. I mean, think of all those days Nehemiah would have spent growing up in a foreign culture, trying to maintain a little bit of his Jewish culture, all the while wondering if God was going to answer their prayer. As an exile from his homeland, he served as a slave to the Persians in what seemed like meaningless circumstances. Even as a cupbearer, Nehemiah must have wondered what God was up to. His organizational leadership abilities lay dormant as he served the king day after day, month after month. But God knew what he was doing. He was using Nehemiah's circumstances to prepare him to accomplish his vision. In the same way, God is using your circumstances to prepare you for his vision of your life. Nate shared the good news that it doesn't matter what you've done in the past. It doesn't matter how you might have failed. It doesn't matter what mistakes you've made, because you've come to the place where you are. Because when you come to the place where you're willing to say, God, I want to see people the way you see them. God, I want you to break my heart for things that break your heart. God will take all those circumstances from your life and he will weave them together in a way to use you to accomplish his vision. Not everything that happens is part of God's plan, but God has a plan for everything that happens. The second thing Nate shared was what God originates, he orchestrates. In other words, how is never a problem for God. Nehemiah demonstrates that when God puts something in our heart to do, our responsibility is to do what we know how to do while we wait for God to do the things only he can do. Lastly, Nate shared that vision builds our faith by serving as a constant reminder of our dependence on God. Few things give our faith a more thorough workout than a divinely inspired vision. When we embrace a vision, it reminds us of how truly dependent we are on God. All of us are dependent on God. It's just that we very easily forget that. But embracing a God-given vision has a way of reminding us of our dependence on him. Well, friends, thanks for listening. Enjoy jumping to discussion questions. I'll see you next time.